What if you lived in a world where every crown was fragile without the blessing of a priest? Where the silence of a cathedral could echo louder than the commands of a king? Welcome, dear listener, to Pattern of Power, a place where history unfolds not as a lecture, but as a gentle story, woven softly into the quiet of your night. Before we begin, may I invite you, gently, to like this video, to subscribe if you haven't already, and to leave a comment, perhaps telling us where in the world you are listening from tonight. Your presence here is part of the story we share together. Now, let the weight of the day slip away. In this moment, you do not need to hold on to anything. The world beyond your room can wait. Its noise, its worries, its demands, all set aside. Like a cloak hung at the door, feel the air around you, still and soft. Feel your body resting, sinking into comfort, supported and safe. Your breath moves slowly, in and out, like the tide against a quiet shore. Steady, unhurried, eternal. With each breath, imagine the world of long ago, the medieval age, where the sound of bells marked the passing hours, where stone towers rose beside stained glass windows, where power and prayer were bound together, each shaping the other. Tonight, we will wander into that world together. A world where religion shaped not only belief, but kingdoms, rulers, and the destiny of nations. And as we journey, let the story guide you, not with urgency, but with ease. Each word, a step into calmness. Each image, a soft lantern light along your path. So rest here, with me. The night is long. The story is gentle. And together, we begin. When the Empire of Rome crumbled, the world it left behind was filled with silence and uncertainty. Cities that once echoed with marching legions stood quiet, their marble forums chipped and weathered. Roads once stretched across continents, now broken, grass creeping over stones. Travelers walked them more slowly, more cautiously, unsure of who ruled the lands they crossed. In this world of fracture, where kingdoms rose and fell with the turning of seasons, people searched for something enduring, something stable, something eternal. And so, they turned to faith. The church, standing like a lighthouse on a stormy shore, became that anchor. Its rituals, familiar and steady, told men and women that beyond the chaos of kings, beyond the violence of raids, there was a greater order, A divine pattern. A heavenly kingdom that did not crumble. Imagine a village in those days. The roofs of thatch darkened by rain. A dirt road winding between wooden cottages. At its center, a small stone chapel. Bells cast from metal that caught the morning light, ringing across the fields, reminding farmers and children alike that they belonged not only to their lords, but to God. In monasteries, monks bent over manuscripts, their candles flickering in the dimness, preserving words from the ancient world. Psalms copied letter by letter. Histories saved by patient hands. In a time when much was being lost, faith became the guardian of memory. For the weary, for the frightened, for the lost. Religion was more than prayer. It was a map through the uncertainty. It gave shape to time. Morning bells calling to labor. Evening bells calling to prayer. Seasons marked not just by harvest and snow, but by feast days and holy fasts. The kings who emerged in this fractured Europe. Warlords, chieftains, claimants to thrones, understood that to rule with strength, they needed more than soldiers. They needed sanctity. A crown of gold was heavy, but without the blessing of the church, it was fragile. Thus began a bond, forged in uncertainty, between throne and altar, between ruler and priest, between the fragile hands of men and the eternal hands of God. And so, as dawn broke on the medieval world, religion was not merely belief. It was the loom upon which power was woven. As the centuries unfolded, the church grew not only as a refuge for the weary, but as a pillar of power, its roots deepening, its branches stretching over kings and commoners alike. Monasteries became more than places of prayer. They were fortresses of knowledge. Quiet sanctuaries where the scratching of quills on parchment was as mighty as the clang of swords in battle. Within their walls, monks preserved the wisdom of ages, translating scriptures, copying histories, storing away fragments of thought that might have vanished forever, had not these patient guardians kept watch. Bishops, too, emerged as figures of immense influence. In cities still scarred by Rome's fall, their voices rang louder than local lords. Their robes of office carried a gravity that swords alone could not command. To hear a bishop speak was to hear authority wrapped not in iron, but in sanctity. For people believed that his words carried echoes of heaven. Imagine the scene. A great hall of timber and stone. A king seated upon a chair of carved oak. Warriors at his side. Yet when the bishop enters, bearing his staff and wearing the simple yet commanding robes of his office, even the king rises, for his rule must be bound to the church's blessing. The church's lands grew vast, stretching across valleys and forests. Farms tilled by peasants owed not only their harvest to their lords, but their tithe to the church. Gold and grain flowed steadily toward abbeys, allowing them to raise towers, to ring bells that could be heard across miles, to build cathedrals whose spires pointed heavenward, visible reminders that God's house stood above all. And with this power came the shaping of law itself. Canon law, sacred law, rules that bound communities together when civil law faltered. From questions of marriage to matters of inheritance. From disputes between neighbors to the coronation of rulers. The church became both court and crown, binding daily life to sacred order. For the people, this was comfort. To live within the church's embrace was to feel connected to something eternal. A thread stretching back to Christ and the apostles. A chain of blessing that no sword could sever. For rulers, it was necessity. To be crowned without a bishop's blessing was to stand vulnerable. To defy the church was to risk not only rebellion, but the silence of heaven itself. Thus the church's voice grew steady and strong, whispering into every corner of medieval life, until it became not just the guardian of souls, but the architect of power. In the medieval world, a king was never simply born to rule. He had to be made into a ruler, not by sword or bloodline alone, but by ritual. Coronation was the sacred thread that stitched heaven to earth, that transformed a mere man into a sovereign blessed by God. Without it, a crown was little more than gold. With it, it became a halo of authority, shimmering with divine approval. Imagine the hush inside a vast cathedral, its walls of stone cold with morning mist, torches flickering along the nave, their light trembling against stained glass windows, images of saints and martyrs glowing faintly, as if heaven itself leaned closer to watch. The people gathered, nobles wrapped in furs, peasants in rough homespun. Each had come not only to see their ruler crowned, but to witness a miracle. For in their eyes, this day was more than politics. It was a binding of earth to eternity. At the center stood the bishop, or sometimes the archbishop, his robes heavy with embroidery of gold thread. His hands held a book of scripture, worn with years of prayer. He alone could perform the sacred rites. The ceremony began with words of oaths. The would-be king swore to defend the church, to protect the weak, to uphold justice in his realm. His promises echoed across the stone vaults, rising like incense, solemn, binding, Then came the moment of anointing. Oil, consecrated and blessed, was drawn in the sign of the cross upon the king's forehead, his chest, sometimes even his hands. The scent of the oil, mingling with wax and incense, filled the air. And in that moment, people believed. Heaven's grace descended. That God Himself marked this man as chosen. Next, the regalia, each object carrying both symbol and weight. A sword, not just a weapon, but the promise to defend the realm with justice. A scepter, sign of authority. A shepherd's staff to guide the people. A ring, binding king and kingdom together as in marriage. And finally, the crown itself, lifted high, gleaming in the dim cathedral light. When it descended upon the king's head, the crowd would gasp softly. Some crossed themselves. Some whispered prayers. For they believed that in that instant, the man before them became more than mortal ruler. He became God's anointed, a figure whose authority was touched by heaven. Trumpets sounded. Choirs lifted hymns that had echoed since ancient Rome. Te Deum Laudamus, voices rising in reverence. And the people knelt, nobles bending as low as peasants, all acknowledging that the new king's strength flowed not from his armies, but from divine sanction. Coronations differed across kingdoms. In England, the kings were crowned at Westminster Abbey, upon the ancient coronation chair. In France, the Cathedral of Reims was chosen, where holy oil was said to have been delivered from heaven by a dove. In the Holy Roman Empire, rulers journeyed to Aachen, to sit in the throne of Charlemagne, linking their power to the great emperors of the past. Each of these ceremonies, though wrapped in local custom, carried the same truth. No king stood alone. Without the blessing of the Church, his rule was fragile. But with it, he claimed eternity itself as ally. And so, coronations became more than ceremonies. They were theater. They were sacred spectacle. They were lessons in power, teaching every subject, from knight to farmer, that kingship was not merely human. It was divine order made visible. But this bond was double-edged. For if the Church could crown a king, it could also unmake him. A pope's refusal to bless, an archbishop's withholding of anointing, could unravel claims to power, leaving a crown empty and a throne abandoned. And thus, every coronation, though filled with incense and hymns, also carried a shadow, a reminder to kings that their authority rested not in isolation, but upon the altar of the church. It was a delicate dance, one that bound king and bishop together. Neither holy master, neither holy servant, each dependent upon the other. And for the people watching, each coronation was more than a rite. It was reassurance that their world, fragile though it seemed, rested in order. A divine chain stretched from heaven, through altar to throne, binding earth in sacred symmetry, as the crown gleamed in candlelight, and hymns drifted into the high vaults. A new chapter of rule would begin. Yet beneath the gold, beneath the blessing, one truth lingered. Power in the medieval world was never without prayer. Beyond kings, beyond bishops, beyond the solemn arches of cathedrals, lay the heartbeat of medieval faith, the lives of ordinary men and women, who wove religion into the very fabric of their days. To understand how religion shaped power, one must look not only at thrones and altars, but at cottages of timber and clay, at fields brushed by dawn, at market squares humming with voices. For in these humble places, religion was not distant doctrine, but daily rhythm. Imagine the break of morning, when the first light glimmered across thatched roofs. A rooster called, a dog barked, a farmer stirred from sleep upon his straw mattress. His first act, before touching plough or bucket, was to cross himself, whispering a prayer of gratitude for waking, his lips moving quietly in the dimness, asking for strength through the labor to come. The bells of the parish church marked the passing of hours. Prime, terce, sext, none, vespers. Each bell told the people not only the time of day, but their place in the order of creation. Work began with prayer. Meals were blessed with prayer. Even storms in the fields drew quick pleas to saints for mercy. Life was bound by these sacred rhythms. The church taught that sin was everywhere, lurking in thought, in word, in deed. And so the people sought protection in rituals. Holy water at the chapel door, the sign of the cross traced on brow and chest, charms blessed by priests hung over doorways, candles lit for the souls of the departed. Every stage of life was marked by religion. Birth welcomed with baptism, childhood woven into catechism and feast days, marriage sealed before altar and priest, death embraced with final rites and prayers for safe passage into eternity. A person might not hold land, might never wield power, but through the church, they felt part of something eternal, a kingdom that stretched beyond life itself. And so, Faith became the ground upon which authority rested. For when a king or lord commanded, he did so not only as ruler of men, but as guardian of a sacred order believed by all. To disobey him was to flirt with sin. To rebel was to risk damnation. Power did not rule the body alone. It ruled the soul. Yet within this devotion, there was comfort. The weary widow lighting a candle for her lost husband. The shepherd whispering the Lord's Prayer as he walked the hills. The mother teaching her child to cross herself before sleep. These small acts, multiplied across millions of lives, gave the medieval church an authority far deeper than soldiers could command. Festivals brought joy. Bright banners unfurled across village greens. Maypoles wrapped in ribbons. Harvest feasts swelling with bread and ale. Yet all were tied to holy days. St. Michael's Feast, the Nativity, Easter dawn. Life's celebrations were never apart from religion, but always woven into its calendar. And even the market square, the hum of barter and coin, was framed by faith. For stalls often stood in the shadow of the parish church, and travellers passing through villages often paused first not at taverns, but at chapels, to pray for safe journeys and good bargains. Religion was power, not because it forced its way into lives, but because it was life. It defined time. It gave meaning to suffering. It sanctified joy. It promised redemption. The local priest held little land, but much influence. He blessed crops, counseled marriages, heard confessions whispered in shadow. His words might soothe or condemn. A simple sermon, spoken from the pulpit of a small parish church, could steer the hearts of dozens, perhaps hundreds. And in turning hearts, entire villages shifted in loyalty. The reach of the church's authority was invisible, yet it spread everywhere. Think of a medieval traveler, a merchant winding along a muddy road. He stops at dusk in a town he has never seen. He feels no kinship with its lords, no bond with its rulers. Yet when he enters the church, the same prayers are spoken, the same Mass celebrated, the same saints invoked. It is in this familiarity, this shared language of faith, that he feels at home. And it is in this unity that power spread without swords. So when rulers sought control, they did not only raise armies, they sought to bind their people through religion, to show themselves as defenders of faith, patrons of churches, protectors of saints. In doing so, their commands resonated not only in the marketplace, but in the conscience. Thus everyday believers, in their prayers, their festivals, their quiet rituals of faith, became the foundation upon which kingdoms were built. For no crown could shine unless upheld by millions of folded hands. If kings ruled by swords, then popes ruled by silence, and by words that lingered longer than steel. In the medieval world, there were two crowns, one of gold, worn by kings and emperors, gleaming in battle and court, the other unseen, a crown of keys, worn by the Pope, symbol of the authority given to Saint Peter, the keys to heaven and earth. The tension between these crowns defined centuries, a dance of alliance and rivalry, devotion and defiance. Sometimes Pope and King walked side by side, blessing one another, strengthening thrones and altars alike. Yet at other times, their rivalry tore nations apart. Picture a pope in Rome, seated upon a throne not of jewels, but of ivory and carved wood, his robes flowing with embroidery, his voice carrying across Christendom. He commanded no army. He held no fortress beyond his walls. Yet a single letter, a single decree, could shake kingdoms. For his power was spiritual. And in the medieval mind, spiritual power outweighed the sword. Kings trembled at the thought of excommunication. To be cut off from the church meant to be cut off from heaven itself. No sacraments, no mass, no hope of salvation. A king excommunicated became a king abandoned, for subjects feared to obey him, lest they too fall under condemnation. His enemies saw opportunity. His allies turned cold. The throne, once steady, began to crumble. And so, monarchs bent their pride before popes, kneeling, kissing the ring upon the pontiff's hand, their crowns lowered in humility, even as their hearts burned with resentment. For they knew that to rule without papal blessing was to rule in shadow. Yet kings were not always submissive. There were emperors who challenged papal power, who asked openly, "Who holds the true authority? Is it the Pope, with his keys, or the Emperor, with his armies?" The investiture controversy would become the great storm of this rivalry, when emperors insisted on appointing their own bishops, placing their own men in robes of sacred office. Popes resisted, for to allow kings to control the church would be to bow heaven to earth. The clash raged for generations. Excommunications hurled like weapons. Emperors forced to kneel in snow before the gates of papal castles. Yet even outside these dramatic battles, The daily reality of crown and papacy was one of delicate balance. The Pope required the protection of kings, armies to defend Christendom from invaders, wealth to build cathedrals and hospitals, while kings needed papal words to sanctify their reigns, to crown their heirs, to justify their wars as holy. Consider a coronation of an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Without the Pope's blessing, his title meant little. But when crowned by papal hands, he could claim not only kingship, but empire, a universal dominion stretching across Christendom. His power framed not by conquest alone, but by heaven's decree. Even distant monarchs, kings of England, France, Spain, all sought Rome's approval and feared Rome's anger. A papal interdict could close every church in a kingdom, silence bells, extinguish altars, deny weddings, baptisms, funerals. Imagine an entire land plunged into spiritual darkness. The people would not blame the Pope. They would turn upon their king, demanding peace with the Church, pleading for forgiveness. It was this invisible weapon that gave the Pope power no army could match. To deny sacraments was to deny eternity. And what soldier, what noble, what king could withstand the weight of eternal silence? Yet still, monarchs dreamed of freedom from papal chains. They longed to rule without Rome's interference, to command without papal sanction. Some succeeded briefly, others fell swiftly. And in this struggle, the medieval world was shaped by rivalry as much as by devotion for the people. This conflict was both distant and near. They heard whispers in sermons. They saw their rulers travel across mountains to meet with popes. They watched as wars were justified in the name of faith. And though they rarely saw Rome itself, they felt its shadow, stretched across every village, every parish, every crown. So the story of the medieval age is not merely one of kings and their castles, but of popes and their altars, bound together in rivalry and dependence, each needing the other, each resenting the other. Two crowns glimmering, one of gold, one unseen, both claiming the world beneath them. If the power of kings and popes seemed vast, there was yet another force, one that walked quietly along dusty roads. One carried not in crowns or decrees, but in footsteps, the footsteps of pilgrims. For in the medieval world, journeys of faith were not only personal quests, they were public displays of devotion. And in their very movement, they shaped kingdoms, trade, and politics. Imagine the sight. a winding road through fields and forests, stretching toward the horizon. Along it, travelers walk slowly, staff in hand, cloak wrapped against the wind. They carry little, perhaps a satchel with bread and dried meat, perhaps a small flask of wine or water. They are poor and noble alike, men and women, young and old, all drawn by a single desire: to reach a holy place, to touch a relic, to kneel at a shrine. Pilgrimages could last weeks, months, even years. To journey to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, to Canterbury in England, to Rome itself, or to the distant Holy Land, was to leave behind one's village and step into a wider world. But what gave these journeys such power were the relics that awaited at the end. Bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, vials of sacred oil, shrouds that once touched holy bodies. To us, they may seem like simple objects, yet to the medieval soul, they were bridges between heaven and earth, tangible pieces of eternity, relics that promised healing of body, forgiveness of sins, and even salvation. And so, relics became not only sacred, but political. A cathedral that held a renowned relic drew pilgrims from across Christendom. Their coins filled markets. Their offerings enriched the church. Inns grew around the roads. Taverns bustled with travelers. Whole towns flourished because they stood near holy bones. Rulers understood this well. A king who secured a relic for his city gained more than piety. He gained power. The relic brought wealth, loyalty, and legitimacy. For people believed that God himself favored the land where holy remains were kept. Think of the crown of thorns, carried to Paris by King Louis IX, displayed in St. Chapel beneath soaring stained glass. Pilgrims traveled from every corner of Europe to see it, strengthening the prestige of France, binding the monarchy's authority with divine favor. Or consider Canterbury, where the martyrdom of Thomas Becket transformed an English cathedral into one of the greatest pilgrimage sites in the world. The shrine drew thousands yearly, not only enriching the church, but shaping England's identity. Kings themselves bowed before the memory of the slain archbishop, acknowledging that spiritual power could rival even their own. Pilgrimage was also a quiet form of diplomacy. A king who joined a holy procession, who walked barefoot with peasants toward a shrine, showed humility before God, earning admiration and binding loyalty. Even the proudest rulers sometimes set aside their horses and walked dusty roads, to prove that they too were pilgrims before heaven and beyond kings. Beyond towns lay the deeper power of pilgrimage, the power of unity. A farmer from the fields of Normandy might walk beside a merchant from Venice. A knight from Germany might share bread with a widow from Ireland. They spoke different tongues, yet on the road of pilgrimage, they were kin. All sang the same hymns. All bent knees before the same relics. In this mingling, ideas spread, alliances formed, loyalties deepened, and in turn, power flowed not from one throne or one city, but through the countless roads that wound toward shrines. Yet pilgrimage was not only sacred, it was sometimes manipulated. Relics were stolen, bought, even fabricated. Towns vied for the prestige of possessing a saint's remains. For where relics lay, wealth followed, and where wealth gathered, rulers turned their eyes. In this way, the quiet step of pilgrims, the hushed prayers before relics, became instruments of politics, shaping not only faith, but economies, borders, and even wars. So while armies clashed on battlefields, while kings and popes argued in palaces and cathedrals, another kind of power walked slowly across the land. The power of millions of footsteps, echoing along pilgrim roads, carrying with them devotion, coin, loyalty, and change. And perhaps it was this kind of power, soft yet unyielding, that proved most enduring. For when the swords had rusted, and the crowns were forgotten, the shrines still glowed with candles, and the relics still drew the faithful, whispering that heaven's touch could still be felt upon the earth. If relics drew pilgrims across roads and mountains, then cathedrals became the destinations that crowned their journeys. Great stone giants, rising slowly over decades, sometimes even centuries, their towers reaching like fingers toward the sky. To walk into a medieval cathedral was to walk into more than a building. It was to step into a vision of heaven itself, carved and painted in stone and glass. Imagine a small town, its houses clustered of timber and plaster, streets muddied by rain, roofs sagging with thatch, and at its heart, a structure so immense that it seemed to belong to another world. Arches soaring higher than the tallest trees, bells tolling across valleys, stained glass windows glowing with colors brighter than any cloth in the market. This was no mere church. It was a statement, a sermon in stone. Kings and bishops built cathedrals not only for worship, but as symbols of power. Each stone laid was an act of devotion, but also a declaration. This city is chosen. This land is holy. This ruler is blessed. Think of Chartres, its twin spires piercing the French sky. Every pilgrim who approached could see them from miles away. A landmark of faith, but also of authority. The city beneath it thrived, its markets swelling, its name carried across Europe. Or Canterbury, rebuilt in towering Gothic form after Becket's martyrdom, its shrine glowing with gold and candlelight. Pilgrims poured into England to kneel before its altar, filling the realm with wealth, binding the monarchy's prestige with the church's sanctity. To construct a cathedral was no small feat. It required masons, carpenters, glassmakers, entire generations of laborers who might never see the work finished. Fathers began the laying of stones. Sons continued the arches. Grandsons carved the final statues. A whole community poured its sweat and coin into the rising structure. And in this shared labor, power was reinforced. For people believed they were not just building a monument, but building their own path to heaven. Inside, the architecture was designed to move the soul. Vaults so high they seemed to vanish into clouds. Columns branching like trees of stone. Stained glass telling stories of saints and kings. Of Christ and Mary. Glowing with divine light when the sun streamed through. For most people of the time, unable to read, these windows were their scriptures, teaching them the lessons of faith, binding imagination to the church's vision. And in every corner, symbols of authority lingered. Thrones carved for bishops, tombs of noble families, coats of arms etched into chapels, reminding worshippers that the sacred and the secular were never apart, that their rulers' names were inscribed not only in courts, but in God's house itself. Cathedrals also became stages for power. Here kings were married, swearing their vows beneath vaults that echoed with hymns. Here nobles gathered in councils, decisions made beneath crucifixes. And here, too, disputes were settled, oaths sworn, alliances sealed, all under the shadow of altars. Even music within these walls carried authority. Choirs of monks sang in voices that rose like incense, melodies weaving through stone arches, reminding all who listened that heaven was near, but also that the church was the gatekeeper. To step into such a place at dusk, when candles flickered against carved saints, when shadows moved gently across the stone floor, was to feel small, yet also to feel embraced. A farmer who entered with weary steps felt lifted into eternity. A noble who entered with pride felt humbled beneath the arches. But beyond devotion, cathedrals shaped economies and politics. Pilgrims flocked to them, filling inns and markets, Merchants thrived in their shadows. Cities grew prosperous. And rulers who sponsored their construction reaped not only prestige, but loyalty. For to build such a wonder was proof of God's favor. And yet, these structures also spoke silently of rivalry. For kings and bishops vied to outshine one another, each new cathedral reaching higher, each spire seeking to pierce heaven more boldly than the last. As if to say, not only is God here, but God favors us. So the rising of cathedrals was not merely about beauty or devotion. It was about power carved into stone, power that endured centuries, power that still stands today, long after kings and popes have turned to dust. And when you imagine the medieval world, picture not only castles upon hills, but cathedrals upon plains, vast, echoing sanctuaries, whose bells carried farther than any royal decree, reminding every soul that faith and power were bound together in walls of stone. If cathedrals stood as monuments of stone, then law stood as a monument of words, invisible yet powerful, binding people as surely as walls, shaping kingdoms as deeply as crowns. In the medieval world, there were two laws, one forged by rulers, by kings and nobles, decrees proclaimed in castles, judgments rendered in halls of timber and torchlight. These were the laws of the land, secular, temporal, rooted in soil and sword. And then there was another law, older, deeper, said to be born not of men, but of God. Canon law, sacred law, woven from scripture and tradition, guarded by priests and bishops, enforced not with soldiers, but with sacraments. At times these two laws walked together. At times they clashed like storms. Imagine a small village quarrel. Two farmers disputing over a strip of land. They might take their case before the local lord, who judged with his steward, measuring fields with rope and stone, deciding who would plough and who must yield. But if the dispute touched on oaths sworn, or promises broken in God's name, it could be drawn into the hands of the church. For in the eyes of faith, a broken oath was not merely dishonor, it was sin. Canon courts grew in strength, handling questions of marriage, legitimacy of heirs, wills and inheritance, all matters that shaped dynasties, and thus power itself. A noble who married without the church's blessing could find his children declared illegitimate, stripped of inheritance, his bloodline weakened, his rival emboldened, all by the judgment of bishops. The church also guarded the sanctity of contracts, trade agreements sworn before altars, debts sealed with oaths, disputes resolved beneath crucifixes. This made merchants and nobles alike dependent on clerical courts. For only the Church could confirm that their promises were bound not only by law, but by heaven. And above all, loomed the most dreaded weapon of canon law: excommunication. To be excommunicated was not merely to be cast from church walls. It was to be cut off from the body of Christ, denied sacraments, shunned in burial, left adrift between heaven and earth. For medieval souls, it was a fate worse than death. And when this punishment fell upon rulers, its force shook kingdoms. Picture a king defying a pope. The decree spreads. Priests refuse to perform mass in his lands. Bells fall silent. Weddings halted. Funerals forbidden. Entire villages left in spiritual darkness. The people, frightened for their souls, turn against their king. Not from rebellion of sword, but from terror of damnation. This was the invisible strength of canon law. Its punishments reached where armies could not. Into the conscience, into the soul. Secular law still held its place. Kings raised courts, judged thieves, punished rebels. Their laws dealt with bodies, property, land and coin. But canon law dealt with eternity, with sins unseen, with vows that stretched into heaven. And in a world where salvation was the highest prize, the Church's law overshadowed the king's. Yet kings fought back. They sought to bend canon law to their will, appointing bishops who were loyal, pressuring priests to shape judgments in their favor. But still, the Church resisted, reminding rulers that while they governed men, it was the Church that governed souls. And so, the people lived in a web of two laws, navigating both crown and altar. Sometimes they overlapped. Sometimes they conflicted. A thief might lose his hand by the king's justice, then seek absolution by the priest's mercy. A lord might claim land by decree, then lose it in canon court. When a bishop declared the oath invalid, the true power of the Church's law was subtle. For it was not written on stone tablets, nor carved into castle gates. It was spoken in whispers at confession, declared in sermons at Mass, recorded in manuscripts hidden in abbeys. And yet, its weight was undeniable, because while secular law ended with death, canon law extended beyond it. To obey it was to protect one's soul. To defy it was to risk eternity. And so, kings ruled lands, but the Church ruled consciences. Two authorities entwined, both claiming obedience, both shaping the destiny of the medieval world. If religion crowned kings, then it also chained them. For in the medieval world, no rivalry was more fierce, nor more decisive, than that between emperors who ruled the earth and popes who claimed to hold the keys of heaven. At the heart of this conflict lay a single question: who appoints the shepherds of God's flock? Who places bishops in their cathedrals, abbots in their monasteries, priests in their parishes? Is it the emperor, with his sword and seal, or the pope, with his blessing and authority? This question became the storm known as the investiture controversy, a struggle that would last generations, reshaping not only empires, but the very fabric of medieval power: the emperor's claim. Imagine the Holy Roman Emperor, robed in silk and fur, his crown heavy upon his brow. He surveys his vast lands, stretching from the Alps to the German forests, from the rivers of Italy to the North Sea. He commands armies. He collects tribute. He judges nobles. And he believes that he, too, has the right to appoint bishops. For to the emperor, bishops were not only spiritual leaders, they were also landlords, rulers of estates, commanders of men, holders of castles and wealth. To let the Pope decide who sat upon these thrones of stone and altar would be to weaken imperial authority, to give away the empire's strength. So emperors placed rings upon bishops' fingers, handed them staffs, symbols of office, declaring that their power flowed from the throne as much as from the altar. The Pope's response. But in Rome, the Pope thundered against this practice. For to him, the Church was no servant of kings, but the bride of Christ, its shepherds chosen by God alone, not by mortal rulers. Pope Gregory VII stood as the fiercest defender of this belief. He declared boldly that emperors had no right to invest bishops with ring and staff, that only the Church could appoint its leaders. And he went further still, proclaiming that the Pope held the power to depose emperors themselves if they defied the will of God. The clash. The emperor at the time, Henry IV, raged at these words. He declared Gregory deposed. He gathered bishops loyal to him. He sent letters mocking the Pope's claims. But Gregory responded with a weapon more feared than swords: excommunication. The decree spread across Christendom. The emperor was cut off from the sacraments, his subjects freed from their oaths of loyalty, his crown shaken upon his head. Nobles rebelled. Rivals sharpened their ambitions. And suddenly the mightiest man in Europe found himself isolated, The humiliation at Canossa. Desperate, Henry IV made a bitter choice. He traveled across the Alps in winter, snow biting at his face, his entourage dwindling in the cold. He arrived at Canossa, where Pope Gregory resided in the fortress of Countess Matilda. There, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow, dressed in the rough robes of penance, waiting for days in the icy courtyard, begging for forgiveness. At last, the Pope relented. Henry was absolved. The emperor entered the chapel, kissed the Pope's feet, received once more the blessing of the Church. The image burned itself into history. The mightiest crown humbled before the keys of St. Peter. A reminder to every ruler that even emperors could bend in the snow. Before papal power. The aftermath. Yet the struggle did not end there. For Henry would rise again. Gather armies. March upon Rome. Install an antipope loyal to him. And the clash would echo for decades. Eventually, compromise came in the Concordat of Worms. In 1122, when Emperor and Pope agreed to share the process, the Church would appoint bishops, but in the Emperor's presence. And bishops who held lands would still honor their feudal obligations to the crown. It was neither full victory for Pope, nor for Emperor, but it marked a turning point, a recognition that in the medieval world, power was never singular. It was always shared, always contested, always balanced uneasily between altar and throne. The lesson for the people of Europe. The investiture controversy was more than a distant quarrel. They saw its effects in their villages. Priests replaced or exiled. Churches closed in interdict. Nobles shifting loyalties as crowns trembled. And for generations after, kings remembered the snow at Canossa. They remembered that even the greatest emperor could kneel barefoot before a pope. And they ruled knowing that their power, however vast, was bound to the silent authority of faith. When popes and kings quarreled over crowns and bishops, one thing could unite them: a cause that reached beyond borders, beyond kingdoms, beyond the rivalries of Europe. The Crusades. They began with words spoken by Pope Urban II in the year 1095. At the Council of Clermont, his voice rising above the crowd, urging Christians to take up the cross, to march eastward, to reclaim Jerusalem, the city where Christ had walked, where he had suffered, where he had risen. The call was holy, framed in the language of salvation. Urban promised remission of sins, eternal reward. Heaven's gates flung open for those who bore the cross as pilgrims and warriors. but beneath the hymns and prayers. The Crusades also became tools of politics, reshaping kingships, empires, and the balance of power. The call of the cross. Imagine a medieval square. A preacher standing upon a wooden platform. His arms lifted. His words aflame with urgency. He speaks of the Holy Sepulchre, of pilgrims harassed by foreign rulers, of Christian lands under the crescent of Islam. His voice breaks with passion, and the crowd weeps. Nobles tear strips of cloth from their cloaks, stitching them into crosses, binding them to their tunics. Men pledge their swords. Women offer their sons. Children dream of distant holy lands. The crusade begins not in palaces, but in fields and villages, carried on waves of devotion. The march east. Yet as thousands marched, the holy cause became entangled with ambition. Nobles saw opportunities for land. Merchants saw opportunities for trade. Rulers saw opportunities for prestige. Armies of Europe surged toward Constantinople, then into the Levant. They carried banners marked with the cross, but also banners of families and lords, each seeking both salvation and gain. When Jerusalem fell in 1099, the bloodshed was immense. Streets ran with cries of both triumph and terror. Churches filled with hymns of thanksgiving. Yet the conquest also birthed new kingdoms. Crusader states, carved out of the East, ruled not by priests alone, but by European lords hungry for dominion. The power of the papacy. For the popes, the Crusades became their greatest instrument of authority. For if a pope could command kings to march, to set aside quarrels and ride together for Christ, then truly his voice was greater than crowns. Urban II's call echoed through generations. Popes summoned more crusades against Saracens in the East, against heretics in Europe, even against rival Christians who defied Rome. The language was always holy, but the reach was political. Kings and glory. 4 Kings 2. The Crusades offered more than devotion. They offered prestige. Richard the Lionheart, blazing through the East with sword and banner. His name carried in song and story. His legend woven into English kingship for centuries. Louis IX of France, later canonized as a saint, journeyed on crusade, presenting himself not only as king, but as holy ruler, protector of Christendom, and even emperors. Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick II, marched east, binding their claims of universal dominion to the cause of Christ's cross. Wealth and trade. Merchants found fortune in crusade. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa carried fleets eastward, supplying armies, transporting pilgrims, trading goods from spices to silk. Wealth poured into Europe, not only through conquest, but through commerce. And as markets grew, so too did power. Towns expanded, economies thrived. The crusading impulse fed the rise of cities and trade, even as it spilled rivers of blood, shadows of violence. Yet beneath the hymns and banners lay shadows. The Crusades unleashed violence upon Jews in Europe. Communities massacred in the frenzy of holy war. They unleashed rivalries between East and West. Christians of Constantinople sacked by fellow Christians in 1204. Their relics stolen. Their empire shattered. What began as a holy mission became entangled in greed, a weapon of power wielded by popes and kings, sometimes against unbelievers, sometimes against rivals within their own fold. The legacy. Still, the idea of crusade lingered, shaping imaginations for centuries. It taught rulers that religion could move armies more effectively than gold, that papal blessing could rally nations, that faith could be both sword and shield. For the common believer, the Crusades were promises of salvation. For kings, they were stages of glory. For merchants, rivers of wealth. For popes, proof that their authority could bend the world. And so, the Crusades were not only wars of the cross, they were wars of power, wars of ambition, wars of expansion wrapped in the cloak of faith, a paradox of devotion and dominion, sacrifice and conquest. And in this paradox, we see how religion in the medieval age could shape not only souls, but empires themselves. If the Crusades carried swords eastward, the Inquisition turned its gaze inward, into the very heart of Christendom, seeking not foreign foes, but hidden enemies within. For the Church feared not only armies at its gates, but ideas in its towns, whispers in its villages, teachings that strayed from orthodoxy, beliefs that threatened to unravel the tapestry of unity. To medieval rulers, heresy was not just error. It was danger. It was rebellion of the soul, a spark that could ignite kingdoms. A king feared that if his people doubted the faith, they might doubt his crown. For his authority rested on divine order. And if that order was questioned, so too was his right to rule. The shadow of heresy. Across Europe, movements rose. Small at first, simple preachers wandering from village to village, speaking in fields and marketplaces, declaring that the church had grown too rich, too worldly. They called for a return to purity, for the simplicity of Christ and the apostles. The Cathars of southern France taught of a stark dualism, light against darkness. They rejected the pomp of bishops, the wealth of abbeys. Their faith drew thousands, peasants and nobles alike. The Waldensians followed a merchant turned preacher, Peter Waldo, who abandoned riches to proclaim poverty and simplicity. His words stirred devotion. His followers gathered in secret, meeting outside church walls. To the church these voices sounded not holy, but dangerous, for they undermined authority, drew people away from priests and sacraments, and thus they threatened not only doctrine, but power, the birth of the Inquisition. And so the Inquisition was born, a system of inquiry and judgment, tasked with rooting out heresy wherever it took root. Papal legates traveled with authority beyond kings. They summoned councils. They demanded testimony. They listened not only to nobles, but to peasants. For in matters of faith, every soul was judged alike. The process was cloaked in solemnity. Trials held in churches. Witnesses called in whispers. Accused men and women urged to confess, sometimes tortured to reveal what they believed, always under the shadow of eternal consequences. For those who confessed and repented, penance might be imposed, a pilgrimage, fasting, the wearing of crosses sewn into clothing as marks of shame. But for those who refused, for those who clung to their convictions, punishment was severe. They could be handed over to secular authorities, burned at the stake, their bodies consumed in fire, their names condemned as warnings. The power in fear. Fear spread. Whispers of neighbors reporting neighbors. Villagers wary of unguarded words. For a jest about priests, a doubt about sacraments, a complaint about tithes, could be twisted into accusation. In this atmosphere, control deepened. For silence was safety. Obedience was protection. Kings often welcomed the Inquisition, for it strengthened their rule. By aligning themselves with the Church's efforts, they proved their devotion, crushed dissent, and rid their realms of voices that might stir rebellion. And so, the union of throne and altar grew stronger, both king and pope bound in a shared cause, to preserve unity, to guard authority, the symbols of authority. Inquisition was more than trial. It was theater of power. Public penances staged in marketplaces. Heretics paraded in shame. Fires lit where all could see, reminding the people that to defy the Church was to defy salvation itself. The Dominican order, founded to preach against heresy, became central to the effort. Learned men trained in theology, skilled in argument. They traveled from town to town, not only condemning, but persuading. They filled pulpits with sermons against error. They filled courts with judgments for orthodoxy. And in their hands, religion became weapon, not of mercy, but of discipline. The paradox of control. Yet even here, we see paradox. For while the Inquisition aimed to preserve faith, it also revealed the fear of authority. Fear that its power was fragile. Fear that a single whispered doubt could ripple into defiance. And in its zeal, the Inquisition left scars. Villages emptied by suspicion. Books burned. Lives extinguished in flames. But to rulers of the time, this was not cruelty. It was necessity. To preserve order. To preserve salvation. To preserve power. The lesson of silence. For the medieval believer, the Inquisition taught one lesson above all: obedience. To remain within the fold was safety. To stray beyond it was peril. And so people clung more tightly to the church. They obeyed priests. They listened to bishops. They looked to kings as protectors of faith. Religion's power was strengthened not only by hope of salvation, but by fear of damnation. And in that fear, both throne and altar found their sharpest weapon. When we think of religion in the Middle Ages, we picture altars and bishops, kings kneeling before popes, pilgrims winding along dusty roads. But the power of faith also shaped something quieter, and yet just as enduring: the rhythm of towns, the heartbeat of trade. For in those centuries, religion was not confined to monasteries and cathedrals. It breathed in the market square. It whispered in the ringing of coins. It lived in the bargaining voices of merchants. Towns built around the church. Imagine a small medieval town. At its center, not a castle, but a church. Its tower rising above wooden roofs, casting a long shadow across stalls and cobblestones. The bells called not only to prayer, but to commerce. For when the bells rang, the people gathered. And when the people gathered, trade followed. Markets were often held on feast days, when villagers and travelers came together for worship. They prayed in the morning, then spilled into the square, trading wool for wine, grain for salt, shoes for spices. Religion gave rhythm to time, and thus it gave rhythm to markets. And it was not by chance. for the church itself granted permission for markets to be held. Bishops and abbots issued charters, determining where and when commerce could thrive. Without the church's blessing, a market might falter. With it, a town could blossom into a city, relics and prosperity. The presence of a relic could transform a humble village into a bustling hub. Pilgrims brought not only prayers, but coins. Inns rose. Taverns thrived. Craftsmen carved souvenirs of saints. Bakers sold loaves to feed the weary. Think of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Once a quiet corner of the world, until the shrine of St. James drew pilgrims from across Europe. Its roads became arteries of trade. Its markets filled with goods from distant lands. Its name carried as far as the frozen north and the warm Mediterranean shores. Or consider Cologne in Germany, whose relics of the Three Magi filled its cathedral with pilgrims, and its coffers with wealth. The town grew powerful. Merchants grew rich. The relic became both holy treasure and economic engine. Monastic centers of commerce. Monasteries, too, were not only places of prayer, but centers of production and exchange. Their lands stretched wide, their barns filled with grain, their cellars stocked with wine and ale. Their workshops turned out manuscripts, candles, cloth. Peasants tilled their fields. Merchants purchased their surplus. Nobles borrowed their wealth. Even kings leaned upon their resources. And so monasteries became arteries of commerce, threads binding the economy to the church's hand. Fairs and festivals. Religion also gave birth to great fairs, annual gatherings tied to feast days, where merchants from distant lands converged. Picture the Champagne fairs in France. 6 great markets rotating through the year, timed with religious festivals, drawing merchants from Flanders, Italy, Spain, even the East. Cloth from England, wine from Burgundy, spices from the Levant, all exchanged beneath the banners of saints. Priests blessed the proceedings. Bishops enforced the charters. Religion sanctified trade, and trade enriched religion. For each deal struck, each coin exchanged, carried the imprint of the church's oversight, its blessing, its protection. Banking and the church. Even the rise of banking, that most worldly of trades, was shaped by religion. For moneylending was bound by canon law, condemned as usury when practiced without limits. And yet, monasteries themselves became lenders. Bishops authorized contracts. Popes issued rulings that allowed certain forms of credit. Thus the church shaped not only what was traded, but how, ensuring that even coins carried the weight of morality. The town as sacred space. But perhaps most striking was how the sacred and the secular blended seamlessly in the town. A merchant might bargain in the square by day, then kneel in the church by night. A craftsman might chisel stone for a cathedral wall, then sell trinkets to pilgrims outside its doors. Every oath sworn in the marketplace was bound by religion. A broken promise was not merely dishonor. It was sin. Contracts often signed before altars. Seals pressed with prayers. And so the town itself became a sacred space, not separate from faith, but infused by it. Every stall beneath the shadow of the church tower reminded merchants and peasants alike that trade was not merely commerce, but part of God's order, the weaving of power for kings and lords. This blending of religion and commerce was invaluable. They taxed markets. They protected fairs. They claimed authority through charters signed in the church's name. For the church, the wealth that flowed from trade-built cathedrals funded crusades, filled treasuries. For the people, it meant that their livelihoods, their prosperity, their very survival was tied to the rhythm of faith. And so, as towns grew into cities, as trade routes stretched across continents, it was religion that had cleared the ground, marked the calendar, and sanctified the exchange. A crown might command armies, but it was the church that made markets. And in markets, power grew as surely as in castles. Thus the destiny of towns, the rise of trade, the hum of coins and voices beneath vaulted roofs, all bore the imprint of faith, reminding us that in the medieval world, even commerce was touched by heaven. Not all power is carried in swords, nor in decrees. Some of the deepest power rests in the shaping of the imagination, in the weaving of stories that settle into the heart. In the medieval world, religion shaped not only the laws and the markets, but also the very way people saw the world around them, and the world beyond. Most could not read. Most could not write. Parchment was costly, books rare, and literacy confined to monasteries and scholars. Yet every villager knew the stories of Scripture. They knew of Adam and Eve, of Noah and the flood, of Moses and the sea that parted, of Christ born in a manger, crucified, risen again. These stories were not carried by pages, but by voices, and by glass. On Sundays the people gathered in their parish churches, the air thick with incense and wax, the priest stepping into the pulpit, his voice rising, retelling tales of saints and sinners, of the paradise that awaited the faithful, of the torment prepared for the damned. Each sermon a thread woven into memory, each word carrying weight beyond the day. And when the priest's voice fell silent, the walls themselves continued to speak. Stained glass glowing with fire when the sun broke through, panels of blue and red and gold, telling stories without words. A peasant who could not read a single letter could look upon those windows and see Abraham lifting his knife above Isaac, Daniel in the lion's den, Christ upon the cross, Mary crowned in heaven. The imagination of Europe was painted in light, shaped by glass that shimmered like jewels, so that even the poorest soul could feel the presence of eternity. These windows were not only decoration, they were teaching, persuasion, devotion made visible, and they bound people to the church. For it was the church that provided meaning, the church that opened the eyes of the soul. In villages too poor for stained glass, there were wall paintings, bright pigments showing devils dragging the damned, angels lifting the righteous. And these images spoke louder than words, reminding even children what fate awaited beyond the grave. Through story and image, religion entered the mind, shaped the dreams, softened the will. The sermons told people how to live. The paintings told them why. And beyond sermons, there were miracle plays, performed in squares and fields, villagers dressing as apostles and prophets, carrying the stories of Scripture into living theatre. A child might see a neighbor become Noah, a friend become Peter. For a moment, heaven and earth touched. Through play, through laughter, through awe, all of this served power. For by shaping imagination, the church shaped obedience. If the world was believed to be ordered by God, if rulers were believed to be chosen by Him, then rebellion was not only dangerous, it was sin. And yet, within this shaping there was comfort. For the same stories that taught obedience also gave hope. They promised that suffering was not endless, that poverty had meaning, that heaven awaited those who endured. The poor man in the fields knew he might never hold a crown, never raise an army, never travel beyond his village. But through the stories of the church, he was bound to eternity. He was promised a kingdom greater than any earthly throne. And so the power of sermons, the glow of stained glass, the paintings upon plaster walls, became tools of both control and consolation. They bound people to rulers, and they bound people to hope. Power flowed not only through decree, but through imagination, through the quiet vision of paradise and punishment, through the colors of glass, the voice of the priest, the gestures of a play beneath open skies. And in this way, religion shaped not only kingdoms, but the very dreams of those who lived within them. The passing of time in the medieval world was not counted by clocks, not by the turning of gears or the striking of bells in measured hours, but by holy days, by feasts and fasts, by the rhythm of the Church's calendar. To live in that age was to feel one's days carried not only by sunrise and sunset, but by sacred seasons. Advent with its quiet expectation, Christmas with its light and joy, Lent with its solemn fasting, Easter with its triumph and renewal. The cycle of the year was not merely agricultural. It was spiritual, woven into worship. A peasant in the fields might mark his labor by the sowing of seeds, by the turning of harvest. Yet above all he marked time by when Mass was sung, when feast was kept, when fasting began. His work was shaped by faith, his joy framed by the Church's blessing. Festivals lifted hearts beyond the weight of toil. Town squares alive with banners, laughter drifting like incense, tables laid with bread and ale. The feast of Corpus Christi, the feast of Saint Michael, the great feasts of Easter and Christmas, each one gathering the community into shared joy, reminding them that they were bound not only to earth, but to heaven. And when the feasts ended, came the fasts, 40 days of Lent, when meat vanished from tables, when bellies rumbled with hunger, when prayer replaced feasting. To fast was to imitate Christ, to share in suffering, to learn humility. For even the mighty king laid aside his banquets. Even nobles dimmed the torches in their halls. All were humbled before the discipline of time. Holy days shaped even the smallest details of life. Weddings delayed until the feasts. Contracts signed on saints' days. Journeys begun after blessings at Mass. People would not start building a house until the feast of a patron saint had passed. Nor would they bury their dead without tying the funeral to the calendar of the Church. The harvest festival gave thanks for bread. Pentecost celebrated the Spirit that bound the faithful. Candlemas filled churches with flickering light. These were not mere traditions. They were anchors, steadying the hearts of people who lived in a world of uncertainty. The Church taught that to obey the rhythm of feast and fast was to live in harmony with heaven, to eat when God gave abundance, to abstain when He called for sacrifice. The body was trained, the spirit strengthened, and rulers too were measured by how they honored these rhythms. A king who ignored fasts, or who failed to provide for feasts, risked not only his reputation, but his legitimacy. Markets themselves followed the holy calendar. Merchants traveled with fairs set to coincide with saints' days. Great gatherings of trade and devotion mingled together. A man might sell cloth in the morning, then walk in procession in the evening, the rhythm of coin and prayer flowing as one. Time itself became a canvas of devotion, painted with days of joy, days of sorrow, days of reflection. For in the medieval imagination, every moment belonged to God, and to live outside that order was to drift into chaos. The power of the Church was therefore not only in crowns or cathedrals, but in the beating of days. The calendar itself was an instrument of authority, telling people when to labor, when to rest, when to feast, when to weep. And in obeying this rhythm, people gave the Church dominion not only over their prayers, but over their very sense of time. For kings might command armies, but it was the Church that commanded the seasons, shaping the calendar of every village, every town, every home. And so religion's power was woven not only into stone and law, but into the ticking of life itself, into the very way medieval men and women felt the passing of their days. In the great tapestry of medieval life, woven with kings and bishops, merchants and peasants, there were threads almost invisible, threads of silence, threads of prayer, carried by those who withdrew from the world, and yet shaped it profoundly. The monks and nuns of Christendom did not rule armies, nor sit on thrones, yet their power was quiet and enduring. Their prayers believed to shield kingdoms, their writings to preserve wisdom, their very existence to hold back chaos. Imagine a monastery on a hill, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind, its bells tolling before dawn, calling brothers from their narrow cells. They rise in darkness, their breath misting in the cold air, robes rustling as they gather in the choir. Candles flicker against carved wood, voices rise in chant, steady, solemn, lifting psalms that echo into the stillness. This rhythm, prayer after prayer, day after day, was their life. 7 times a day they gathered, at matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Time itself reshaped not by king's decrees, but by devotion. For monks believed that by constant prayer, they held the world together. Their chants were not for themselves alone, but for the souls of peasants in fields, for merchants on roads, for rulers in their halls. Their intercession stretched invisibly across the land, a kind of unseen armor, protecting Christendom from evil. But prayer was not their only labor. By day they bent over manuscripts, quills scratching upon vellum, copying scriptures, preserving words of saints, sometimes illuminating pages with brilliant gold leaf, turning holy words into shimmering art. In their scriptoria, monks became guardians of memory, saving fragments of Rome, of Greece, of the Church Fathers. Without their hands, much of the past might have vanished. But because of them, wisdom survived, carried forward into ages yet unborn. Elsewhere, in fields and cloisters, monks worked with their hands, tilling gardens, brewing ale, crafting medicines from herbs. Their knowledge of healing spread quietly. Their hospitality welcomed travelers and pilgrims, weary wanderers finding rest behind abbey walls. Their labor gave life to communities that grew around them. Nuns, too, held power in their silence. Enclosed within convent walls, they spun wool, taught children, tended the sick. Their prayers rose with equal fervor, their devotion as unyielding. In some lands, abbesses ruled their convents with authority equal to lords, managing lands, commanding respect from bishops and nobles alike. And then there were the mystics, solitary figures whose visions shook the hearts of kings. Hildegard of Bingen, abbess and prophetess, whose writings spoke of cosmic harmony, who advised emperors and popes. Her voice, though born in cloistered silence, carried into the courts of the mighty. Catherine of Siena, fasting until her body seemed to waste away, yet writing letters that bent the will of pontiffs, urging popes to return from exile in Avignon to their rightful place in Rome. Her prayers mingled with fire, her visions pressing upon the conscience of rulers. Such figures remind us that even those hidden from the world could shape it. For when kings sought counsel, when bishops trembled in uncertainty, they turned to those believed to be closest to heaven, those whose lives of poverty and devotion gave them authority beyond crowns. The monasteries themselves were engines of economy, their lands vast, their tenants many, their barns filled with grain that could feed towns in famine, their mills grinding flour for peasants, their breweries producing ale that sustained communities. To live near an abbey was to live under its shadow and its blessing. But above all, the monks and nuns held power because they embodied ideals the world revered: poverty, obedience, chastity, devotion. They reminded kings swollen with wealth that treasure rusts. They reminded lords drunk with pride that humility saves. They reminded peasants crushed by labor That prayer has worth. And so, though they seemed removed from the struggles of crowns and armies, their influence was everywhere. In manuscripts preserved, in fields sustained, in prayers whispered, in visions proclaimed. It was the silent power of devotion, a power that never marched to war, yet helped hold kingdoms together, a power invisible, yet immense, shaping not only the faith of a people, but the very imagination of an age. In the medieval world, power did not always speak in words, nor strike with swords. Sometimes it sang. Sometimes it glowed in color. Sometimes it lingered in the quiet beauty of a page, art, music, and manuscripts. These were not simply adornments to faith. They were instruments of authority, shaping hearts more deeply than decrees could, reaching places where law and punishment could not. Imagine stepping into a cathedral at dawn. Light spills through stained glass, reds and blues falling across the stone floor like pools of living fire. The figures of saints shimmer in the glass. Christ stretches his arms in blessing. Mary gazes in quiet majesty. To the peasant who kneels there, the colors are not merely decoration. They are a glimpse of heaven itself. The rulers who built these cathedrals knew this well. For beauty was not innocent. It was deliberate. A cathedral rising above a city proclaimed that this land was blessed, that this kingdom was favored by God. The very stones, the very music echoing within, became proof of legitimacy. Music too carried this power. The chant of monks, slow and solemn, weaving through vaulted arches. The polyphony of choirs beginning to rise in later centuries. Notes intertwining like vines, lifting the soul beyond the weight of earth. To hear Mass sung was not only devotion, it was submission to an order larger than oneself, an order embodied by the Church. Kings and nobles lent their patronage. They funded choirs, endowed schools of music, commissioned works that glorified both God and their own rule. For when hymns rose in their chapels, when organs thundered beneath their ceilings, they too were exalted, lifted as rulers chosen to preside beneath the harmony of heaven. And then, the manuscripts, quiet treasures bound in leather, their pages glowing with gold, their letters twisted into vines and blossoms. A monk bends in candlelight, his quill tracing the words of Scripture. Around the letters he paints delicate flowers, birds in flight, dragons curling between verses. Every page a meditation, every image a sermon without words. To own such a manuscript was to hold power in one's hands. Kings commissioned them. Bishops guarded them. Monasteries treasured them. For they were not only books. They were symbols. They declared wealth, piety, authority. The Book of Kells in Ireland, the Lindisfarne Gospels in England. These works became more than texts. They were holy relics in themselves, carried in procession, displayed upon altars. Even common folk, though they never touched such books, felt their power. When a manuscript was lifted in mass, its gold shimmering in candlelight, the people knelt, believing that heaven's light itself glowed from its pages. Beauty softened obedience. It made devotion sweet. It turned submission into something willingly embraced. For who could resist the glow of glass, the swell of music, the shimmer of gold upon holy words? And yet, beauty also carried discipline. The stories painted in windows, carved in stone, written in books, reminded all of judgment as well as paradise. Devils twisted in shadow, sinners dragged into flame. In beauty there was awe, but also warning. The same colors that lifted hearts could also instill fear, teaching that salvation and damnation were both near, both real, both pressing, and in this mingling of awe and fear, the Church strengthened its authority. It did not only command with decrees. It captured the imagination. It made faith visible. It made obedience beautiful. For kings and nobles, patronage of art was strategy. A chapel painted with frescoes declared piety. A choir of monks chanting in harmony proclaimed order. A golden manuscript carried in procession announced wealth blessed by God. For peasants, art was promise. The colors of glass told them of paradise. The sound of song reminded them that heaven was near. The images in manuscripts they would never read still reached them in sermons, in plays, in whispered retellings. Thus beauty became a current of power flowing through medieval life. Soft, invisible, irresistible. A crown might command loyalty by fear, but beauty captured love. And in love, authority found its strongest root. By the late Middle Ages, the harmony that had bound crown and altar began to tremble. Shadows stretched across the faith that once seemed unshakable. Whispers of doubt stirred in towns and cloisters. Voices rose against the weight of authority. For centuries, the Church had stood as the anchor of life. Yet as cathedrals reached higher, as wealth gathered in abbeys, as bishops moved in splendor through palaces, some began to wonder, had the simplicity of Christ been lost amid gold and power? The people still knelt. They still crossed themselves at the sound of bells. They still filled churches with candles. Yet in their hearts, questions began to stir. Why did indulgences cost so much? Why did some priests live richly while peasants starved? Why were wars fought under banners of the cross? when Christ had preached peace. Movements of reform whispered through the land. The Lollards in England spoke of translating scripture into the language of the people, so that every man and woman might read God's word without priestly gatekeepers. In Bohemia, Jan Hus thundered against corruption, calling for purity in the sacraments. His sermons drew crowds. His words drew fear from bishops, and eventually fire from their judgment. Even before him, John Wycliffe had dared to challenge the Church's riches, declaring that the true authority of faith lay not in priests, but in Scripture itself. His followers carried fragments of translated Bibles into secret gatherings, reading by candlelight, whispering truths forbidden. Mystics too began to speak with uneasy boldness. Voices like Meister Eckhart in Germany, who preached of a direct union between the soul and God. His words soared with beauty, yet alarmed church leaders who feared their independence. And the ordinary faithful, though still devout, began to seek God in ways outside the grand rituals. They formed brotherhoods and sisterhoods of lay devotion, gathering to pray, to meditate, to live simply, apart from clerical pomp. The Black Death had already shaken confidence. Priests fell with peasants. Bishops died in the same streets as beggars. The image of the Church as eternal guardian faltered when death spared no one. People wondered, if the priests cannot protect themselves, can they truly protect us? This doubt did not erase faith. Rather, it deepened the hunger for a purer faith, for a Christ unwrapped from the splendor of cathedrals, for a God who listened not to the wealth of tithes, but to the cry of the poor. And rulers, too, began to see opportunity in this restlessness. Kings who once trembled before papal decrees now tested their strength against Rome. They saw that power might flow not only through alliance with the Church, but through independence from it. The Avignon papacy, when popes resided in France rather than Rome, and the Great Schism, when rival popes claimed the same throne, deepened these doubts. For if even popes could divide, if Christendom itself could fracture at its head, then how unshakable was the authority people had trusted for centuries. In marketplaces, in taverns, in whispered corners of towns, people spoke cautiously. They asked questions once unthinkable. They dreamed of reforms. They longed for change. And though the full storm of reformation still lay ahead, the seeds were already sown, carried in the questions of peasants, in the sermons of reformers, in the books copied in secret. Faith still shaped power, but doubt began to reshape faith. A quiet restlessness spread, a sense that the old order might not last forever. Yet even as doubts grew, devotion remained. Bells still rang across valleys. Pilgrims still walked to shrines. Monks still rose before dawn to pray. The medieval world did not abandon its faith. But within its heart, the whisper of reform had begun. It was a whisper kings would one day seize. A whisper that would fracture nations. A whisper that would birth new paths of belief. But in these late medieval years, it was only that. A whisper. Unsettling yet soft. A current beneath the surface of a vast river. A murmur that the old world was not eternal. And in that murmur, we glimpse the fragile balance of power. How even the strongest authority can tremble when doubt begins to stir in the soul. The whisper of reform had already begun. But then came a shadow so vast, so merciless, that it darkened the whole of Europe. The Black Death. It swept across fields and cities, carried by ships, by rats, by unseen breath. In village after village, doors were shuttered, bells tolled endlessly, carts rolled through narrow streets carrying the dead. Sometimes half a town was gone in weeks. Sometimes whole monasteries fell silent, their brothers buried together in mass graves. For the people of that age, the plague was not disease as we understand it. It was judgment. It was wrath. It was the hand of God. The priests preached of sin, of punishment, of a world chastised, and the people trembled. For the invisible enemy could not be fought with swords, nor barricaded by walls. They turned desperately to faith. Churches filled with weeping. Pilgrims crawled on their knees to shrines. Processions wound through streets with candles. Prayers rising into air thick with the scent of death. Hoping that heaven might look down in mercy. Some sought salvation through extreme devotion. Flagellants marched half-naked through towns, whipping their own flesh until it bled, believing that if they punished themselves, God would spare them. Crowds gathered to watch, some joining in tears, some horrified, but all wondering if these wounds might heal the world. And yet, as priests and bishops died alongside peasants, the confidence once placed in the church began to tremble. For who could intercede when even the intercessors fell? Who could bless when even the bishops were struck down? Some turned against the clergy, accusing them of greed, of fleeing their parishes in fear, of abandoning the dying. And in these accusations, old doubts deepened, new anger stirred, but others clung all the more tightly to faith, lighting candles in darkened chapels, burying their dead with whispered prayers, pleading for mercy from saints and from Mary, hoping that heaven still heard even as earth fell silent. The plague not only scarred bodies, it scarred souls. It altered how people imagined God. For some, he became wrathful judge, striking the world with pestilence. For others, he became the only hope, the only comfort in a world emptied of safety. And in this crucible of suffering, power shifted. Nobles who survived inherited vast lands. Families rose and fell overnight. Kings lost armies not by battle, but by pestilence. Whole monasteries collapsed, their wealth passing into new hands. The church gained and lost in the same breath. Its rituals remained the only path to meaning, the only solace in despair. Yet its failures, its visible helplessness, weakened its unquestioned authority. People sought new ways of devotion. New confraternities and lay brotherhoods emerged. Groups who prayed together outside clerical authority, who cared for the sick when priests were gone, who buried the dead when others fled. The Black Death fractured loyalty, but also created new bonds, born of shared suffering, born of survival. And in its aftermath, Europe would never be quite the same. The economy shifted. Labor became scarce. Peasants demanded more from lords. Kings faced restless populations. And through it all, the question of faith remained. Had God abandoned his people? Or was he calling them to change? The answer was uncertain. But what was certain was this: the shadow of the plague revealed the fragility of every throne, of every altar. It showed that even the mightiest bishop could fall beside the humblest peasant, that the invisible hand of death leveled all. And in that leveling, power itself was shaken. For when faith is tested by fear, when authority is shaken by helplessness, when the people cry out and hear no answer, the seeds of change are sown. The Black Death did not destroy religion, but it reshaped it. It did not silence faith, but it altered how faith was held. No longer unquestioned, no longer as secure. It was a reminder that power, even holy power, rests always in fragile hands, and that when fear spreads like shadow across the land, belief itself can tremble and take new forms. The journey we have walked tonight has been long, stretching across centuries, moving from thrones to altars, from pilgrims on winding roads to monks in silent cloisters, from the triumph of cathedrals to the shadows of plague. We have seen how religion shaped kings, how it crowned their brows and humbled their pride, how it raised cathedrals of stone and whispered through sermons of fire, how it gave rhythm to fields and markets, and how it even bound the imagination of the poor with stained glass and song. We have also seen how it carried shadow, how it silenced dissent with inquisitions, how it bound souls with fear of excommunication, how it shook beneath the weight of doubt and reform, and trembled when the Black Death darkened every land. Yet through all, through triumph and trial alike, one truth lingers. In the medieval world, power was never separate from faith. It was not two rivers flowing apart, but one river carrying many currents. The sword and the chalice, the crown and the cross. The two were entwined like threads in a single tapestry. And in that tapestry, every life, great or small, was woven. Kings who knelt before popes, peasants who knelt before altars, merchants who prayed before signing contracts, monks who prayed for all the world in silence. Together they shaped an age where religion was not a corner of life, but its center. It is easy to think of power as something heavy. Crowns of iron, armies on horseback. But power can also be quiet. It can be a candle glowing against the dark, a bell tolling at dawn, a prayer whispered in secret. These were powers too. Powers that shaped imagination. Powers that calmed fear. Powers that bound millions in a shared rhythm of belief. And now, dear listener, as we come to the end of this story, you may feel the weight of these centuries easing into calm. The voices of popes and kings fade. The chanting of monks grows quiet. The bells fall still. The plague winds pass away. What remains is the hush. The quiet knowledge that human power is always fragile. But faith, in its many forms, endures. Let your body rest in that hush. Let the history drift into dream. You do not need to remember each detail. You do not need to hold onto every image. They will stay with you gently, like the faint glow of stained glass when the sun has gone. Feel the calm in your breath. Slow, steady, the rhythm of in and out, like monks chanting softly in the dark, like waves upon a shore. Tonight you are safe. Tonight you are at peace. Tonight you may lay down your burdens as peasants laid down their plows, as kings set aside their crowns at night, as monks closed their books at the end of day. The story has reached its close, but your rest has only begun. So close your eyes now. Let the images fade. Cathedrals turning into mist. Processions dissolving into silence. Candles flickering out one by one, until only darkness remains. Not frightening, but gentle, soft, protective. And as sleep begins to gather, know that you are carried, just as generations were carried by their faith, carried by their hopes of heaven. You are carried by peace, by stillness, by rest. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be calm. May your heart be light. And may the quiet of history's whispers guide you softly into sleep.